So I'd first like to reiterate some of the thank yous that Patrick sent around earlier, but thanks again to AMCA and Nada and Sarah and Annika and Dina for putting this all together, and to AUB especially for saving our conference, and the generous donors who made this possible. And I really look forward to Professor Kasab's comments later today, so thank you very much, and also Dina, thank you for taking the time to read our papers and think about them. So just before I get started, I just want to give you a brief background on my dissertation, which is focusing on 6 artists, and Gazbia is the only one of my 6 artists who actually lives through the '67 war. So Abdelhadi El-Ghazar is one of my other artists, and I think it would have been really interesting to see how he reacted to the '67 war, and I'll show one of his works in the presentation, but I think he's on a similar track as Gazbia, so perhaps she can shed some light on that. Even though the 2 paintings on the screen, made 18 years apart, look strikingly different, I would like to begin by pointing out their similarities. First, the palette in both works is comparable, mostly blues punctuated by orange and ochre. The green leaves on the left are echoed by the squares of green on the right. The grids in the woman's dress, in the checkerboard floor, and in the brick wall parallel the grid in the other painting. Even the bits of bird food reappear in the black and red specks in the bottom of the more abstract piece. If it were not already obvious, one artist, Gazbia Sirry, painted both of these, though perhaps the only clear indication of this is her unique signature. The long aleph of Gazbia splitting the 2 digits of the date. The juxtaposition of these 2 works raises some questions. Why did this artist move from a powerful figurative style to an almost abstract style in less than 20 years? Are the reasons for this change economic, political, artistic? And in the context of this conference, what impact, if any, did the 1967 war have on her shift? Gazbia is an excellent artist to look at because her transformation from a primarily figural painter to an abstract painter seems to coincide with the war. In this paper, I will attempt to answer these questions. Born in 1925 in Cairo, Gazbia Sirry came of age as an artist during the years surrounding the 1952 Free Officers' Revolution in Egypt, which brought Gamal Abdel Nasser and his pan-Arab socialism to power. After graduating from the Cairo School of Arts Education in 1950, she went on to win many government scholarships that both sent her abroad and supported her art making in Egypt. Paradoxically, this same government also imprisoned her for a few days in 1959 and her husband for 3 years due to their alleged communist activity. Her early paintings are characterized by large, imposing, strong female figures of all classes, representing the new woman of the new Egyptian Republic. But as the 1950s and 1960s progressed, these figures faded until 1967, when they disappeared altogether. Some have posited that this shift was due directly to the Naksa of 1967, emblemized by her work, Grief, which depicts a self-portrait of a floating head in a fiery landscape backed by a pyramid. Jessica Winiger, in her book, Creative Reckonings, states, quote, "The devastation of grief and the sharp break, never looking back, that came after it, communicate to me, as nothing else has, the fundamental significance of that moment for Egyptian intellectuals and indeed all Arabs," unquote. In this paper, I will analyze Gazbia's progression from a figural painter to almost abstract painter and question whether the 1967 war was indeed a major cause for this breaking point. I argue that though Egypt's foreign relations did indeed have an impact on her work, domestic policies alongside her interaction with international artistic movements and their underlying economic factors also led to this shift. In particular, I looked to her time as a fellow at the Huntington Hartford Foundation in California as a crucial influence in her style. Before continuing, I would like to point out 2 caveats. First is that Gazbia is still very much alive, fiery, and she's still painting, and she lives in the neighborhood of Zamalek in Cairo with her husband of almost 55 years. So I was very lucky to interview her in March, which was a great experience, but generally it's been difficult to get access to a lot of her material while I was there. And second, as you noticed already, I've been calling her by her first name, Gazbia. So this is kind of, usually we call artists by their last names, but I just like to point out that this is how she signs her canvases, and it's also a very unique name, so everyone in Cairo knows her by Gazbia. This paper will consist of 3 visual analyses of paintings from 3 different stylistic periods in Gazbia's career in the 1950s and 60s. First, I will look at a work from the early 50s, which could be described as social realism, large, stoic women conveying nationalist messages. Second, I will analyze a painting from the early 1960s, when Gazbia's forceful figuration began to deconstruct. Third, I will examine a painting from 1967, when the figure disappears completely and it was replaced by a grid-like cityscape. Through this progression, I argue that it is not simply the '67 war, but wider domestic political changes, as well as artistic and economic influences abroad that caused this shift. In other words, it wasn't only the trauma of 1967, but the changing markets and networks of art production precipitated by the war and foreign policy that caused her to change her style. When I asked Gazbia in March, who or what is your biggest influence, she looked at me, puzzled. Her husband repeated the question, and without pause, she exclaimed, "Anna, it is me." So for anybody, I'm sure there's maybe none of you here who are non-Arabic speakers, Anna means I, but she did say the rest of the sentence in English. Herein lies, of course, one of the issues of studying an artist who is still building her own narrative. Yet this statement is also useful in analyzing her method. Gazbia, throughout her career, strove to develop her own unique style. Though she was trained in academic art at the School of Arts Education in Cairo, she soon shed these illusionistic techniques for a bright, clear style that recalls Diego Rivera, but don't tell her I told you that. In Motherhood, from 1952, a mother sits with a child on her lap. The most striking aspect about this work is the layering of flat patterns of fabric. The dress of the mother and child, their headscarves, the black coat of the child, the headband of the mother, and the blanket on the bench lay flat against each other and remind me of the depictions of overlapping tents in Safavid manuscript painting or the clashing fabrics in Matisse's odalisques. Even though there is a shadow behind the figure, no light falls on their bodies. Rather, Gazbia defines their forms through thick black contours in an almost graphic style. These contours overlap and cross in the hands of the mother and the feet of the daughter, breaking even a thin illusionism, and perhaps emphasizing where these parts of the body touch. The mother's face is particularly beautiful, her long aquiline nose ending in long arched eyebrows, reminiscent of the work of Amedeo Modigliani or their source, African Masks. The mother's downcast eyes gaze gently upon the child, caring yet stern. Gazbia uses this canvas to express the sentiment of motherhood, but also as a place to explore color and pattern on the surface of the canvas. Juxtaposed with other works from this period, motherhood emerges as one of many different kinds of Egyptian women that Gazbia depicted. Gazbia's women are rich and poor, traditional and modern, political and not. They represent the diversity of women in Egyptian society, emphasizing that Egypt cannot be represented by a singular anonymous woman like Mahmoud Mokhtar's monumental peasant in Egypt's reawakening, but rather is home to a variety of women all striving for a role in the new Egyptian society. Indeed, as Laura Beer has expertly shown in her recent book, Revolutionary Womanhood, the Nasser government enacted policies, from family planning to workplace regulations, to encourage women to become active participants of the new Arab socialist society. The clarity represented in the large, strong female figures conveys a feminist impulse, but also a nationalist one, empowered women participating in and supporting the new nation. Moreover, in concert with government graphic campaigns to depict small families as better families, as you can see from this cartoon from a little later on the screen, motherhood does not represent a brood of offspring, but rather a meaningful and caring relationship between one mother and one daughter. Here again, Gazbia reinforces ideas of new Nasserist femininity. In addition to this nationalist message about the role of women in the new nation, Gazbia employs a modernist painterly technique in the juxtaposition of those flat planes. Here she exhibits her knowledge of art movements beyond the academic style of the art school. This style does not conflict with the nationalist message, but rather supports it, as artist herself illustrates that she too has a role as a modern woman artist in this new society. In 1962, as Patrick mentioned before, President Nasser issued the Charter for National Action, a document written by Nasser himself outlining new socialist policies for Egypt, including land redistribution, nationalizations, limited working hours, and also family planning. Gazbia painted a large canvas that celebrated these reforms, called Inspiration of Agricultural Reform, which now hangs prominently in the Museum of Modern Egyptian Art in Cairo. In the work, a strong woman stands stoically over a squatting man as sketchy faces of the masses hover in the background. Instead of looking more at this work, however, I would like to analyze another painting from the museum, yet one that is not on view, called Swirl Me Around Lemon from 1960. This work also depicts two figures, yet they lack the weight of the two in motherhood. They are two children, a boy and a girl, connected by their arms, which flow into one another. The boy is swinging the girl into the sky, and she seems weightless, her dress billowing behind her. The two figures are positioned in front of a strange landscape, a tall building on the right and a shoreline on the left, dotted with boats and drying laundry. A giant cat hovers in front of the building, and a bird flies past the shore. This composition, while made up of discernible objects, lacks the realistically defined space of motherhood and Gazbia's other works of the early 50s. Additionally, the clear nationalist message has been lost and is replaced by an unstable, weightless space with shifting horizons. The two figures, on closer inspection, reveal themselves to be portraits of Gazbia and her husband, Adel. We can identify her by her short, spiky haircut, which she still has, and even today, this little boy looks like Adel with his broad eyes and big lips. This painting was painted in 1960, during Adel's imprisonment, and perhaps this ordeal was the cause of the uneasy space in the work, as well as the reason for the lack of nationalist message. Gazbia still uses the thick black graphic contours to define the forms, but the boy's shirt exhibits increased abstract experimentation. The two large animals diverge from realistic spatial depiction and are perhaps symbols, the black cat a symbol of Gazbia's independence, and the bird a hopeful symbol of Adel's flight from prison. Behind all this, the cityscape predicts Gazbia's later style of grid-like skyscrapers, though here the building is still populated by small silhouettes in the windows. The double portrait and the deconstructed space reflect Gazbia's growing disillusion with the state, even in light of the new reforms. The state had reduced her and her husband to mere children, connected by that state's marriage laws, but torn apart by its repressive political policies. Gazbia no longer aims to convey a nationalist message about the role of women, but rather subtly expresses the trauma and pain of her marriage to a man imprisoned by a state she once supported with her artwork. Many of her paintings from this period depict children, often seemingly lost in cityscapes of increasing abstraction. Perhaps these children represent the lack of citizens' agency, an agency that had once been promised by Nasser's pan-Arab nationalism. In 1965, Gazbia earned a fellowship at the Huntington Hartford Foundation in Pacific Palisades, California, an artist colony in the Santa Monica Mountains. Though she had traveled and studied often in Europe, this was her first visit to the United States. Huntington Hartford the foundation was named after him. He's a man who is the scion of the AMCA supermarket fortune, and also the builder of the Gallery of Modern Art at 2 Columbus Circle, which was closed in 1968. However, Hartford was vehemently against the abstract expressionist movement that had swept the New York scene and strove to support artists engaged in representational art. It was perhaps because of her figuration that Gazbia was awarded the residency at the colony. So here, this is the building of the Gallery of Modern Art at 2 Columbus Circle, which some of you may know has been renovated as the Museum of Art and Design. And these are one of the just very distinctive bungalows of the colony on the upper right. And this was one of Gazbia told me this was one of her great friends at the colony. Her name was Esther Rawlick. There are a few examples of Gazbia's work produced during this time. Though at the end of her stay at the colony, the actor Vincent Price, who you may remember as the old scientist from Edward Scissorhands, purchased all of her work. resulting in a very epic party also. One painting shows a California mountainside with drips of paint and one of the very distinctive bungalows from the colony. Another is a self-portrait in front of an abstract background with a fish and a bird, representing perhaps the two worlds of sea and sky, and also maybe Gazbia's love of fishing. Upon her return to Egypt in 1966 and 67, Gazbia arrived a changed artist, because both of her experiences abroad and the political context of Egypt. In an untitled piece from 1967, a large black nude leans across a canvas, split between an empty white void and a gridded cityscape without a horizon. The figure is turned away from the viewer, her head bent in shame. The figure falls from the purity of the white space into the dense reality of the city. Instead of a powerful, strong Egyptian woman, we are presented with a vulnerable, shamed figure. Though the black figure looms large, most of the work of the piece is dedicated to this intricate and colorful city on the right. This type of cityscape, which we saw in Swirl Me Around Lemon, would come to define her work from the late 60s through the 70s. This painting emblemizes and maybe explains Gazbia's shift from figuration to grid-like cityscapes bordering on abstraction. Though the 1967 war must have had an impact on Gazbia, as evident in the work Grief that I showed earlier, the progression of work from the 1950s through the later 60s shows a continuity of disillusionment with the Egyptian state, which led to a shift from figuration to abstraction. Additionally, Gazbia spent time at a California retreat, specifically not for abstract painters. And here I'm thinking of ironic process theory. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, which means if I say something like, don't think about Nasser in a bikini, what are you thinking about? Nasser in a bikini. So there's this kind of, you were not supposed to be doing abstract painting at this colony, so I think that it was probably part, at least made her more cognizant of abstraction and what was happening on the global art scene with abstraction. This most likely brought the issues of abstraction versus figuration to Gazbia's attention, as it was surely something the artist discussed in this context. When she returned to Egypt, she began to change her figurative style, not only because of a disillusionment with the social realism in support of the state, but also because of an increased engagement with the issues of abstraction and figuration being discussed in the global artistic community. Furthermore, the international market had begun to privilege abstraction more. In the 1960 Venice Biennial Pavilion, catastrophe. Sorry, it crashed. Send or send. Hold on. The 1960 Venice Biennial Pavilion of the United Arab Republic, so as many of you know, representing both Egyptian and Syrian artists in this year, included many abstract paintings in its catalog. And as you can see here, the cover of the catalog has an abstract painting on it. Tahia Halim and Abdelhadi El-Ghazal, the Egyptian artists of that year, neither of whom were solely abstract painters, submitted mostly abstract work for this exhibit. Thus, it is clear that the commissioner, Salah Tamil, was beginning to have a preference for the abstract. So also, for those of you who study the Syrian context, this year also included Louis Kayali and Fethi Muderis, so it would be interesting to also see if their artwork from this year was different or not. Notably, the abstract works of both artists, Tahia Halim and El-Ghazal, have very low visibility today in Egypt's museums and art historical publications. I don't know if anyone has ever seen this painting by Ghazal. It's very, compared to the things that Patrick was showing us before, it's very, you can see how it's the same artist, but it's quite different. In her turn towards abstraction and away from clear figuration, Gazbia must have also been reacting to this increased call for abstraction on the global market. To conclude, I hope I have exhibited the complexity of Gazbia's series' slow shift from socialist realist figuration to figureless cityscapes as reacting to political as well as artistic and economic factors. The art movements of the early Nasser era were informed by social realism, but also by a state that encouraged artists to focus inwards. Thus, Gazbia and many of her peers looked to Arab and non-aligned countries to build a uniquely un-Western modern art practice based in a state-supported art system. As the Nasser era wore on, Gazbia and others became increasingly disillusioned with the state, as it became more oppressive, even imprisoning artists and their loved ones. At this point, the artwork lost some of the clarity of social messages from the earlier optimistic years. As the strength of pan-Arab socialism waned, the influence of international styles grew, especially with Sadat's infitah, or open-door policies of the 1970s. Thus, in addition to the traumatic emotional impact of 1967 on artists and intellectuals, the deconstruction of pan-Arab nationalism led artists to look to art movements outside Arab and non-aligned territories. The breakdown of socialism also led the state to become a lesser player in supporting the arts, and thus the international art market grew in importance for these artists. At least in the case of Gazbia, we can say that it wasn't simply the psychological trauma of 1967, but the fundamental shift in the market and network of art production precipitated by the war that caused the figures in her work to fade.